This is a brief introduction to World War I. World War I was the result of increased tension among many of the countries in Europe between 1900 and 1914. There were national rivalries such as between Germany and France, jealousies over territory, economic competition from the Industrial Revolution, competition of size of the army, navy, development of weapons and ships, the size of colonies, and unrest in Central Europe. Main factors that caused World War I. The outbreak of World War I was a result of complex interactions and tensions that had been building between European countries. This included jealousy and competition over economic, land, and military power. Independent German kingdoms had won the war against France, which then unified them. As an attempt to limit France's power, Germany formed the alliance. Thus, the Triple Entente was made as a counterbalance. The Triple Alliance was formed in 1880 and consisted of the countries Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Italy. The Triple Entente was formed in 1905 and consisted of the countries Great Britain, France, and the Russian Empire. These two alliances were meant to be a deterrent to war, but ended up doing the opposite. In 1901, Europe was relatively peaceful, as Queen Victoria's descendants had married into many different royal houses around Europe, and it was thought that it was unlikely that family would fight family. The Industrial Revolution was prosperous with improvements in healthcare, sanitation, and care of the poor. However, it created tensions as different nations had different army sizes, weapons, ships, colonies, and rates of economic progress. Standards of living were uneven, and there was a big difference between the rich and industrialized countries such as Great Britain and Germany. Governments were also afraid of rising influence of socialism and anarchism too. The main factors that caused World War I can be subcategorized into four main groups: militarism, imperialism, the alliance system, and nationalism, or Main. Militarism is a belief that all nations should build and maintain strong armed forces to prepare themselves against attack or promote their national interests. Nations increased their military spending, and most of them had introduced conscriptions by 1871, except for Britain. When Germany started to build its navy, Britain got suspicious and they began competing over whose navy was bigger by building dreadnoughts. Alliance system. This was meant to prevent war, but then turned out to do the opposite. These nations would help each other with military support. This meant small conflict would lead to large ones because of imperialism, and their colonies would also be dragged into war, such as Australia. Imperialism is when a country increases its power by gaining control over new territories to create an empire. European powers had been claiming new territories for centuries. They had colonized much of North and South America, Australia, and parts of Asia. By the 19th century, they had been competing over Africa. As Germany was a newly unified nation, they were still trying to claim new territories. They also attempted to block off France by sending troops to North Africa, but Britain supported France and more tension grew. Nationalism is a sense of pride in and love of one's country. Nationalism united the German kingdoms as well as Austria-Hungary, as they all spoke German. Most of the people from Bosnia-Herzegovina wanted to join with the Serbs to form their own nation, and Russia supported them. So, when a Serbian was accused of assassinating Archduke Franz Ferdinand, Russia was drawn to the conflict that followed. The outbreak of World War I. First, the Serbians in Bosnia-Herzegovina wanted to leave Austria-Hungary and form their own nation. Russia supported them. The Emperor of Austria-Hungary was scared of this national movement and sent his nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand, and his wife to win over the people by a royal visit. When they had arrived, a Serbian nationalist, Gavrilo Princip, killed them. Austria blamed Serbia, and the following month was full of confusion and bluffs. Then they issued 10 harsh demands. Serbia agreed to 9, but not one of them. After 1 month, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia on the 28th of July 1914. Russia promised to protect Serbia, but Germany wanted Russia to stop preparing for war. Russia didn't respond, so Germany declared war. 2 days later, Germany declares war on France and invades neutral Belgium. Kaiser Wilhelm II was Emperor of Germany and grandson of Queen Victoria. The royal houses of Europe had intermarried. Germany wanted to defeat France first with the Schlieffen Plan by going through Belgium, but because Britain was bound by an 1839 treaty with Belgium, Britain ended the war. On the 23rd of August, Japan, an ally of Britain, declares war on Germany. The USA finally entered the war as a German submarine or U-boat attacked a British passenger ship, killing hundreds of Americans. The United States of America also entered the war in 1917 because financially Great Britain and France owed them money, and that money would not be repaid unless they won the war. The USA was also back allies for the whole war and realized that Germany was trying to recruit Mexico. Australia's entry. In Australia, a wave of enthusiasm for war swept the country before 1914. The reasons for enlistment were varied and complex. Some men were driven by a desire to show what their new nation could contribute to a world conflict. Others went to war purely out of loyalty to the mother country, Britain. Many of the first waves of volunteers who enlisted to fight were former British soldiers. Others were British citizens who happened to be living in Australia. In addition to these people, some wanted to show their support for Britain in case Australia should need Britain's help at some stage in the future. There were young men who joined out of a spirit of adventure too. These men saw the war as an opportunity to leave home, see the world, meet beautiful foreign women, and experience life beyond Australia's shores. Many women encouraged their husbands, boyfriends, brothers, and even fathers to enlist. The opportunity to earn a good income also acted as an incentive. As the war progressed, hatred of the enemy also became a motivation for enlistment. People also enlisted because it was considered cowardly if you didn't, and parents wanted kids brought up on military stories and compulsory military training. Among those who offered to enlist were Aboriginal Australians. Only 400 Aborigines were accepted for service. All others were rejected on the basis that they were not of substantial European origin or descent. When Australian soldiers returned from World War I, there were many benefits available to them to assist their readjustment to civilian life. Aboriginal soldiers, however, were denied access to these benefits. Of course, not all motives for joining the war effort were noble. There were stories of soldiers changing their names before enlisting in order to get away from their wives or other commitments. Others enlisted to escape the boredom of jobs they hated, to leave school early, or to escape the strict rules and confines of their family homes. Despite the positive response by many, not all Australians were enthusiastic about the war. Some argued that it was not Australia's war and that Australian troops would make little difference to the final outcome of the war. Others were opposed to the war because they were pacifists, people who are opposed to violence and war. One group of pacifists was the Jehovah's Witnesses, a religious group whose beliefs prevented them from participating in any armed conflict or wars. There was also a small group known as conscientious objectors, people who opposed war and refused to perform military service because it went against their beliefs, religion, or conscience. The Women's Peace Army, led by a woman named Vida Goldstein, was a women's organization made up of pacifists and conscientious objectors. Their mission was to mobilize women in Australia who opposed the war. Goldstein, who was also a well-known suffragette, attacked large numbers of people to public meetings. Finally, there were a small number of Australians who did not enlist because they were afraid, or because they believed that it was in their best interest financially to stay at home. Very few records relating to these people exist today, but we do know that those who were reluctant to go to war often used excuses such as poor health or family responsibilities to explain their decision not to enlist. In total, however, all of the groups who objected to the war only made up a small percentage of the total population. In 1914 and through most of 1915, the dominant feeling towards the war was positive and supportive. It was only as the harsh reality of war became clear to Australians that this initial enthusiasm began to fade away. Nature of warfare. Unlike earlier wars, World War I was fought across a large area against many countries. New technologies emerged as well as trenches. Heavy artillery was used for the first time, as well as improved machine guns. Germany introduced gas, but it was then banned under a treaty in 1925 called the Geneva Protocol. Tanks were first used. However, they were not extremely effective at the start. Large-scale aerial warfare was conducted for the first time. Zeppelins were also created, but then replaced by multi-engine bombers later. Submarines were widely used, and ships were used for trade and communication, as well as goods and people. There was also the development of radios, which improved communications. Where World War I was fought. Unlike earlier wars, World War I was fought across a large part of the world and involved many countries. This was because alliances were formed, and countries all over the world were owned by empires at the time, such as Australia was owned by Britain, so it had to participate in the war. The war spread all over Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East, and was fought particularly on the Western Front, near the areas of France and Belgium. The Western Front. Unlike earlier wars in which the soldiers moved around constantly to gain an advantage, both sides were forced to dig trenches as they were evenly matched in technology and tactics. The Western Front was the name given to the images of trenches, mud, blood, and barbed wire that were the features of the long drawn-out war. It was an area covering from the Belgian coast to Switzerland, consisting of 700 kilometers of a border of trenches. The Western Front was considered the defining experience, or theatre of war, because the war was fought mainly in trenches, and because most of the major countries fought. It is like theatre, as we relate trenches to World War I. War on the Western Front was considered senseless, because war became a series of attacks and counterattacks, each achieving little but costing millions of lives. No Man's Land was a narrow strip of land between opposing trenches that belonged to neither army. Attempts that were made to break the stalemate followed a pattern, which was a long and sustained artillery attack. Opposing trenches would be bombarded with explosive shells, and these attacks could go on for a few hours or sometimes for many days. The Battle of Somme. The Battle of Somme was one battle that attempted to break the stalemate. It was fought in August 1916 and lasted 4 months. It was the first use of the tank, and lots of air power too. Allied forces focused on a 19-kilometer line in northern France. They used 1.5 million shells in 1 week and gained 8 kilometers with the cost of 620,000 Entente soldiers dead or injured, with Australia being involved, and 500,000 Germans dead or injured. However, it really didn't achieve much, and after a while, everything returned to where it had started. There was terrible loss of life in battles such as the Somme, and towns such as Passchendaele, Villers-Bretonneux, Ypres, and Amiens. Even the nurses joined the war. The influence of the Industrial Revolution. Weapons such as the telegraph, tanks, submarines, aircraft, gas, and guns were utilized, and they increased mobility on the Western Front and eventually broke the stalemate. The telegraph allowed faster communication and contact between commanding officers and soldiers fighting on the front line. With the telephone and wireless system or radio, tactical decisions were made quickly. Unfortunately, telephone lines had to be laid in new locations and could be damaged easily, and radios were very heavy. Tanks were very useful as they ran down the barbed wire obstacles and trenches. However, they were mechanically unreliable in the beginning. They frequently broke down or became stuck. Fumes and heat filled the inside. However, by the end of 1917, tanks had been improved. German submarines or U-boats were launched to destroy merchant ships. When they became unrestricted and started destroying passenger ships from the USA got involved. Aircraft played a pivotal role for all sides of World War I when the conflict began in 1914. Early forms were typically unarmed and used in the reconnaissance role until personal weapons were added. From there, the machine gun was finally fixed to these aircraft to create the fighter aeroplane. Many deadly gases were being invented, including those like chlorine and mustard. These weapons took a huge step into chemical warfare. This was considered horrific and inhumane because they could not be seen, affecting civilians and soldiers alike. They jeopardized the fundamental human right to breathe, or to see, and could not be avoided without a gas mask. Finally, guns. After the Industrial Revolution, weapons had never been easier to create. Germany was producing 14,000 machine guns a day. Hence, we can see that the Industrial Revolution really was a big step towards war. Trench warfare. Trenches were made by soldiers who used shovels to dig. Australians were especially good at this, and that is how they earned their nicknames, diggers. In front of the trenches were barbed wire to stop enemies from rushing into the trenches. They also had sandbags stacked so they could put machine guns on them and spray down the enemy. The trenches along the Western Front were approximately 700 kilometers long, stretching from the coast of Belgium to the border of Switzerland. In most cases, trenches were 2 meters deep by 2 meters wide. The Allies used 4 types of trenches. The front line trench was usually about a kilometer from the Germans' front trench. Further behind this front line trench was the support trench, with men and supplies to assist those on the front line. Further behind again was the reserve trench, with more emergency supplies and men. Smaller communication trenches connected all the trenches and allowed for the movement of messages, supplies, and men. Soldiers took turns being in the front line trenches. Sometimes they would be there for 8 days, then had 4 days in the support trenches. However, during major battles, soldiers could be there in the front line for much longer. Soldiers were aware that conditions could change at any time. Artillery from the enemies meant that death and injury could come at any time, leaving smashed and dismembered bodies and wrecked trenches. The end of the war. As the USA ended the war, Russia was exiting the war because of the communist revolution in Russia. The Battle of Le Hamel was a battle that took place on July 1918, with the Australians and Americans against the Germans in the town of Hamel. This battle was said to be one of the most well-prepared battles, with the Allies using infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft attacks. And the battle was finished within 93 minutes. The Battle of Amiens was another battle that began on the 8th of August 1918. In this battle, the Allies pushed the Germans 7 miles. These events were what made Germany surrender. And on the 11th of November 1918, World War I ends and the armistice is signed. The impact of war on Australian society. Australia had a population of fewer than 5 million and lost about 60,000 men in World War I. At first, the Australians thought it was an adventure, and many soldiers went over to be part of that, and others went because Australia promised Britain 50,000 soldiers. It was also considered cowardly if you didn't go to war. Later in the war, Australia promised Britain another 50,000 men, so William Morris tried to allow conscription. He felt very strongly that this was necessary, and even crossed the floor. The soldiers disagreed with the conscription because some didn't want to fight next to people who were already forced to go there, and others didn't want to drag people into the war. By late 1916, Australia was a bitterly divided country. Not only was there a growing dissatisfaction with the war, but a real sense that there was inequality of sacrifice. Many working-class Australians felt that they had contributed the most in terms of enlisting soldiers, and that they were also being exploited at home. There was a perception that middle and upper-class people were less affected by the war. Some were even seen to be profiting from lucrative government war contracts. These perceptions were not always accurate, but they still had an impact on the growing divisions in the nation. The War Precautions Act. In 1914, the federal government passed the War Precautions Act, which gave the government increased powers for the duration of the war. This act gave the federal government the legal right to, among other things, monitor and intern German Australians, impose a direct income tax, censor letters and publications, and set fixed prices for certain goods. Impact on economy. World War I had a major economic impact on Australia and other nations. The cost of providing weapons, ammunition, and supplies to the forces at home and overseas was vast. To meet these expenses, the federal government introduced income tax. it was also necessary to borrow funds from overseas. Australia borrowed heavily from Britain to build vital wartime infrastructure, such as expanded railways. Australia would take over 20 years to pay back loans taken out during the war. The redirection of raw materials to the war effort and the needs of wartime industries caused inflation. As a result, the cost of living in Australia rose by up to 50% during the war years. The war also disrupted international trade. Naval blockades and the use of shipping for military purposes meant fewer ships were available to move trade goods to overseas markets. The Australian government had introduced tariffs on imported goods to protect its local wartime supplies. Many countries looked elsewhere for trade and discovered new sources in Japan and the USA. On the positive side, however, Australia developed new industries. The fact that fewer goods could be brought in from overseas meant that inventive Australians began to develop alternatives that were made here. By the end of the war, 400 new products were being manufactured in Australia. The Newcastle Steelworks, opened in 1915, was flourishing. The Australian National Shipping Line had been established, and the role of the Commonwealth Bank expanded considerably. The Conscription Debate. Conscription was one of the most bitter arguments of the war, forcing men to go to war against their will. The number of enlistments started to decline as news of the deaths of many came, and because of this, the Australian government tried to pressure people into joining through propaganda. Prime Minister Billy Hughes held 2 plebiscites, or referenda, to vote on whether or not people should be forced into the military. However, his party were twice narrowly defeated. Supporters of conscription tended to be middle and upper class people of British and Protestant background. These people, known as pro-conscriptionists, argued that it was the patriotic duty of Australians to continue to support the war effort. They accused opponents of being lazy and selfish, of being German lovers, and of letting down the thousands who had already given their lives. In pro-conscription propaganda, images of noble Australian soldiers and their families are shown suffering for the good of the country as they fight the Germans. Opponents of conscription were more likely to be working class, Catholic, and of Irish background. Catholic Archbishop Daniel Mannix was the unofficial leader of the anti-conscription campaign, and he urged Catholics to vote no. Those who opposed conscription claimed that Australia had already given enough of its young men. They said that it was not really Australia's war. They also argued that several 100,000 soldiers had gone voluntarily to the war and that it was not necessary to force Australians to fight. Anti-conscription propaganda urged people to vote no in the plebiscite or death ballot. Hope you learned something today, and thank you for watching this video. See ya!